So you like butter, but you're wondering, should you be eating more olive oil? I bet you've been in this situation so many times where you've been wondering, what kind of fat do I add to my food? How do I season things? And in fact, I bet inside of that decision, there's a lot of fear around butter, around fats, around oils. So I want to get into, should you be adding more olive oil onto your food? And is there any fear there that's actually not so helpful for you when it comes to food and seasoning, in this case, butter? So we're going to dive into all of that. Definitely watch this to the end, because we're going to be talking about how diet culture is very sneaky and shows up in really insidious ways and actually interrupts our ability to be intuitive eaters and to feed and nourish ourselves in a way that is really pleasurable and joyful. We definitely want to take a listen to this. But before we dive into things, I want to introduce myself. My name is Catherine Metzler. I'm a registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, here to help you create peace with food and your body, and to stop all of this from taking up so much headspace. I deliver videos to you weekly, so if you're new here, click subscribe below, like this video, and if you're not new here, welcome back, and let's dive into things. So part of existing in a diet culture means that you and I are surrounded by all kinds of food rules, and it can get really confusing. How do you differentiate between what is fact, what is fiction? How do you develop skills around becoming an intuitive eater when you're constantly reading articles about what's bad for you, what's good for you? Think about any foods that you feel confused about. I'm remembering eggs as being a topic of debate, bacon, coconut oil, the list could really go on and on. One minute we're learning that something is bad for us, one minute we're learning that something is good for us. And I think this really speaks to the nuance of nutrition science and the difficulty of studying something to determine whether or not it is good or bad for us. The reality is there's all kinds of things that impact our health and well-being. And when we start to isolate a specific nutrient or a specific kind of food and say, this is the cause of everything bad that's happening to you, we really need to be cautious about that and question whether or not that's actually true, because I think it's a really reductionist way of looking at health and well-being. There are so many things that contribute to our health and well-being, and so I want us to think about that as we start talking about this conversation of, should I be having more butter, or should I be having more olive oil, or should I cut out butter entirely? Because I think that really sets the stage for health is complex. And also, I want to talk about some other things too. It would be remiss of me as a dietitian to not talk about the debate that is out there around the differences between different kinds of oils. More specifically, talking about saturated fat versus unsaturated fat. Part of the recommendation around reducing your overall butter intake is related to the saturated fat content. So generally the recommendation, as you may have heard, or maybe you know this yourself, is to reduce your overall saturated fat intake to improve your heart health. And while there is some truth to this, I want to talk about specifically how this can get really skewed and how sometimes this recommendation cannot be so helpful when you're wanting to create a more peaceful relationship with food. What I mean by that more specifically is that a recommendation around a food or a food group can very quickly turn into a food rule, and that ends up being not so helpful for us. So let's talk about briefly what a food rule is, how you might recognize it, and how you can reframe this to think about whether or not you could be adding butter into your diet or onto your food. So a food rule is exactly what you can imagine. It's any rule that you might have around food that dictates what you should and shouldn't be eating. One of the ways that you can spot this is noticing the language that you use around food. Are there ways in which you think about food in regards to, is it good or bad, healthy or not? Do you feel guilt for eating certain foods? In this case, if we talk about it in the context of butter, what are you noticing when you're thinking about adding butter to your vegetables or to your bread? Do you feel fear around adding that? What is your notion of what healthy is when it comes to this food? Do you deem certain foods as healthy or not healthy? This gives you a sense of whether or not you have a food rule within you. And you likely do when it comes to butter, because again, we've been told all kinds of things about what is healthy and not healthy when it comes to fats and oils. The most interesting thing about this conversation in regards to butter and olive oil is that research supports that if you don't like the food, you're not going to be eating it. So let's think about that in the context of vegetables. Maybe you can imagine yourself cooking some vegetables on the stovetop. You're wondering, you're even looking at the butter and you're looking at the olive oil and wondering which one of these do I add to this dish. And maybe you're really feeling like to add butter. It will add a certain kind of flavor. It will make the food more enjoyable, but instead you add the olive oil. The olive oil tastes okay, and you're eating it because you feel like you should be eating it. The likelihood that you're going to eat less of that food if you're not really liking the olive oil or the flavor that it adds to it is pretty high. And so we want to be thinking about that again, zoom out and ask ourselves, am I going to enjoy this food more if I add butter to it? Am I going to consume it more if I add something that I enjoy to it? One of the things I think can be really helpful in order to reframe things, rethink about things in regards to food rules that you may have, in this case about butter and olive oil, is to ask yourself, would I be eating differently if I didn't have this information? Would I feel a greater sense of freedom around food if I didn't have fear around consumption of butter? How might things change for me in regards to my relationship with food and how I'm eating if I didn't have this fear that I have around butter? That they tend to experience a felt sense of being out of control around food when they're eventually exposed to it. So it's that we want to balance these two things simultaneously, that oftentimes outside food rules are actually not helpful for us. For example, when someone says you need to reduce your saturated fat intake, butter is bad for you. Immediately, even in your body, if you notice anything, it might be some tension that comes up, some fear that comes up, some tightness in your stomach. And that is also not healthy, feeling stressed out about everything that we're eating. I often say that it is always more harmful, the stress that we're feeling around food, than the actual food itself. Not to mention that butter has some wonderful qualities. It has vitamins A, D, E, and K in it. It's got some calcium in it. These are all things that are also helpful for our body in regards to what it needs. So we really want to work towards moving away from this binary thinking of butter is bad, olive oil is good. That there's so much nuance there, and health is not that simplistic. Yes, there is some research that supports reduction of saturated fat as it relates to heart health, but I would argue that there's a lot more there as it relates to health and well-being. When we're talking about the social determinants of health, that's a really important part of this conversation. So my advice to you is to add butter where you'd like to add butter. Generally speaking, for a lot of people, it shows up on bread, it can show up when you're making vegetables, it shows up when we're cooking, and honestly, not every dish is going to taste better with butter. The last thing that I'll say about this is that your body benefits most from variety. What I mean by that more specifically is variety of all kinds of foods and variety within the larger macronutrient group. So when it comes to fats, having different kinds of fats that you can pull from, that you cook from, is what your body benefits from the most. So sometimes cooking with butter is wonderful. Sometimes cooking with olive oil is wonderful. Sometimes cooking with canola oil is wonderful. That your body would like to get a little bit of everything throughout the week, throughout the month, throughout the year. So don't stress too much around the butter that you're adding to your bread or your vegetables or other dishes, and be mindful and get curious about any kind of shoulds that exist for you, any kind of food rules that exist for you, and most importantly, ask yourself, is the addition of this butter going to make this food more joyful? And how will this food being more joyful impact my eating experience positively? Can I be present with the food? Will I be eating it with delight? Will I not want to binge later on food because I'm actually getting satisfaction from the food itself? Remember that satiety, feeling sated, feeling satisfied after a meal, is connected to your joy and pleasure at a meal. And research supports this too. We know that the more we enjoy a meal, the more pleasure we take in it, the more that we're going to feel sated. So if you're forcing yourself to eat things that you don't want to actually eat in the name of health and well-being, it's actually not healthy after all. Plus all the stress that you're feeling about what you're eating, what you're not eating, the anxiety that comes up, all of that makes eating and the experience of eating just really stressful and not enjoyable. The take-home message here is that your body benefits most from variety. Food rules impact your relationship with food, your satiety, whether or not you're eating the food. It can really just mess things up for you. And my recommendation to you would be to get curious about any food rules that you have, and also to include butter where you'd like to add butter, and to get a variety of different kinds of oils, because that's what our body likes best. Our body prefers to have a variety of different kinds of fats overall in our diet. And the last thing to remember is that health is more complex than just one food. We cannot isolate one food and say this is the cause of everything that is impacting the health and well-being of an individual, because that's not true, and that's a really reductionist way of looking at health and well-being. My hope is that you walk away from this conversation feeling a little bit more sense of ease, that there are so many things that contribute to your health and well-being, and that adding butter into your diet is okay. It's okay to get a variety of different kinds of oils. Your body needs fat. There are benefits to eating butter as well as eating olive oil, and that we want to be cautious about any places that there are food rules showing up for you. So if you like this video, click like below, comment below, ask me your questions, tell me your experiences. This is a real opportunity for us to continue to be in conversation about all these food rules that exist in diet culture. And I will see you here next week.